Hello, welcome to Unit 1 of our course. Unit 1 is a little bit unusual. It's a rather abbreviated week. We start on Thursday, June 12th at 12:01 a.m. and the unit ends on Saturday, June 14th at 11:59 p.m. As a result of the abbreviated nature of Unit 1, I've decided to only have the discussion boards for this unit. So the only assignments that you're required to complete for this unit are the assigned reading and the associated discussion boards. There are 2 discussion boards for Unit 1 of the course. All of your posts for Unit 1 are due by Saturday, June 14th at 11:59 p.m. Now, remember you're required to post your own initial response to each question, as well as 2 responses to other students' comments for each question. In this unit, we're examining the impact of the Second World War. The Second World War was the most devastating war in human history. Huge numbers of people were killed in the conflict, and the conflict certainly deeply impacted the United States. In this unit, we're not going to focus on the battles that took place. Rather, we're going to examine the impact that the war had on the home front within the United States itself. There are 2 discussion board questions. The first deals with what you might call the social impact of the war. For this discussion board question, you are asked to consider the impact that the war had upon one of 2 communities within the United States. You may discuss the impact that the war had on the African American community in particular, or you may discuss the impact that the war had upon women in the United States. I'd like to just briefly introduce each of these aspects. In regard to the African American community, World War II had a huge impact on African Americans in a variety of ways. World War II was presented by the United States as a war against racism. In the Atlantic Charter, which was a statement of the war objectives of our government, the United States stated that one objective of the war was to wipe out racism across the globe, to combat racism across the globe. Clearly, Nazi Germany was an incredibly racist regime, as was Imperial Japan, although that's somewhat less well known. The Nazis committed horrific atrocities against individuals that they considered to be quote-unquote racially inferior. And the Imperial Japanese government did as well. However, clearly, the United States did not have a very good record in terms of race relations in this period either. And the community that felt this most severely was the African American community. The United States government for decades, and really for centuries, had treated African Americans as lesser, as sort of second-class citizens, and in general, African Americans were disrespected and faced a variety of forms of prejudice within the United States. And this was certainly still the case, into the Second World War. African Americans were, of course, keenly aware of this and took the opportunity presented by the war to protest against prejudice and discrimination. African American leaders promoted what was known as the Double V campaign. The symbol V was used as a symbol for victory during World War II. We're more familiar with this symbol as a peace symbol. But during World War II, this symbol was flashed as a symbol for victory in the war in Europe and victory in the war in Asia. If you watch any old film of World War II, it will end with a giant V on the screen, and that was associated with achieving victory in the war. Many African American leaders said, let's take this opportunity to promote victory, yes, victory against the Nazis and the Japanese abroad, but also victory against racism at home. If we're going to go thousands of miles overseas to fight against racism in Europe and Asia, shouldn't we also fight against racism within the United States? And ultimately, this campaign made a great deal of progress, and in fact helped to intensify the civil rights movement that picked up speed in the late 1940s and in the 1950s. Perhaps the most significant change achieved initially was a result of the work of a man by the name of A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph, by the 1940s, was a fairly well-known civil rights activist. And A. Philip Randolph, in the build-up to the war, pressured the administration of Franklin Roosevelt, who was president at the time, to adopt non-discrimination policies in terms of employment. A. Philip Randolph personally met with President Franklin Roosevelt, and he suggested and urged strongly that President Roosevelt mandate that no factory receiving federal money be allowed to discriminate against individuals on the basis of race. At this point, most companies and factories in the United States discriminated against African Americans. It was very hard for African Americans to get jobs in industry, and often they were put at the sort of bottom rung of the employment ladder, receiving the worst jobs and the lowest paid jobs if they were given any opportunity. A. Philip Randolph felt that this was unjust, and he approaches Roosevelt and basically says, if a company receives dollars from the federal government, there should be policies put in place which ensure that they employ people on a non-discriminatory basis. Roosevelt was reluctant to take this step. Why? It's important to remember at this point that the Democratic Party still had a large base of support amongst white Southerners. Franklin Roosevelt received an overwhelming majority of the vote of white Southerners, and he was often reluctant to alienate the white Southern vote, and he thought that this might do that. A. Philip Randolph threatened that if Roosevelt did not go along with this policy, or institute this policy, that he would organize a march of African Americans on Washington, D.C. to protest against Roosevelt's government. Franklin Roosevelt didn't want this. He also received a majority of the vote amongst African Americans, and he didn't want negative publicity associated with this issue. Franklin Roosevelt ultimately, under pressure, agreed to institute the Fair Employment Practices Commission, the FEPC. This commission would basically ensure that any factory that received federal dollars would hire racial minorities on a non-discriminatory basis. This opened up a huge opportunity for African Americans. Many African Americans during World War II would move from the rural South, from states like Mississippi and Alabama, where they had worked largely in agriculture and domestic service and fairly low-paid employment, to many would move north to industrial cities like Detroit and Chicago, or move west to new industrial centers like Oakland and San Diego, and would find employment in factories. Almost all of the factories during World War II were receiving money from the federal government because they were making weapons of war. So this had a huge and sweeping impact. There was a mass movement of African Americans to cities like Chicago, Detroit, Oakland. Today we think of these cities as having, large African American populations. Prior to World War II, these communities, the African American community was much smaller in these cities. Now, this movement north, I think overall had a positive effect for the African American community, though it did create some pressures, tensions, and conflicts as well. The biggest conflict emerged over housing. Many of the residents of urban Chicago and Detroit, were first or second generation immigrant families from Europe, from Eastern and Southern Europe, and there emerged racial tension and conflict between the newly arriving African Americans moving into the city and the immigrant communities that existed there. Riots actually broke out on occasion. Generally, these riots emerged due to white ethnic communities resisting the movement of African Americans into their neighborhoods, and there were fairly violent clashes in cities like Detroit. Economic opportunities did improve for African Americans during the war. Also, another reason for the movement of African Americans out of the South was the development of new agricultural machinery during the war. In 1944, a new machine for picking cotton was introduced in the rural South, and this significantly decreased the demand for African American laborers in agriculture in the South, which also served as a push factor for African Americans departing the rural South. African Americans faced discrimination in the Army too. They served in segregated units during World War II, and it was often difficult for African Americans to become officers. There were exceptions. Some African Americans did rise to the rank of officer, but it certainly was challenging and difficult to do so due to discrimination. Now, the second issue that we're going to discuss in the other discussion board, also, the impact of the war upon women is very significant as well. That's another part of the discussion board. Women were encouraged to enter the workforce in large numbers during World War II. 12 million American men were enlisted in the military, and as a result, there was a shortage of male labor to work in the factories. So women were actively recruited to work in factories, really in heavy industry for the first time. And there was a significant increase in women's engagement in the paid labor force during World War II. The imagery of Rosie the Riveter emerged during this period. This image of women, flexing their muscles, saying, "We can do it." And the government, released this sort of message, this messaging to encourage women to become actively engaged in the labor force to support the war effort. Many women found themselves, alone, raising their families, managing work and family responsibilities because, their husbands, their loved ones were overseas. So women faced new challenges and had new opportunities during the war. This was true for women of all races, African American women, Latino or Hispanic women, Caucasian women, all experienced these new challenges and new opportunities. Another issue that we're discussing in the second discussion board is the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. This, I think, most would agree is one of the more disgraceful episodes of the war, certainly for the United States. During the war, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued an executive order. And this executive order stated that all Japanese Americans living on the West Coast had to leave their homes and had to move to relocation centers inland. The supposed justification for this order was the fear that Japanese Americans might engage in sabotage to support the Japanese war effort. Both Japanese American citizens and non-citizens were forced to leave their homes and move to essentially concentration camps within the United States. Many people lost their homes and lost their property as a result of this. There was no evidence that Japanese Americans were engaged in sabotage. In fact, there was not a single act of Japanese American sabotage against the United States during the war. Yet this order still went into effect, and huge numbers of Japanese Americans were forced into these rather unpleasant relocation centers or concentration camps. Clearly a violation of their constitutional rights and liberties. These camps were guarded by U.S. military personnel. They were surrounded by barbed wire. It's important to note, they weren't like the camps that existed in Nazi Germany, where people were intentionally murdered and killed. I don't think there's a direct analogy to the Holocaust. The United States government was not trying to kill Japanese Americans. But still, people were imprisoned wrongfully, without committing any crime, without any due process, and simply because they were Japanese Americans. So I think it is a fairly significant atrocity more than that perhaps, a fairly severe atrocity carried out by the United States government against a large number of American, both citizens and non-citizens. Tragically, the Supreme Court ruled that this was constitutionally justifiable. The Supreme Court argued that the interest of the government in protecting the safety of and preventing sabotage and preventing the safety of the American people outweighed the individual rights of Japanese Americans, both Japanese American citizens and non-citizens. So I'll be interested to hear your thoughts on this important issue as well, which I think was a pretty clear violation of, large numbers of Americans, both citizen and non-citizens' rights. Thank you. I look forward to working with you during this unit.